Putin seizes $55 billion from oligarchs as Russia's economy bankrupts. It's more than a headline. It's a mirror reflecting the contradictions and crises of modern capitalism itself. You see, behind every billionaire stands a system that creates billionaires, and behind every act of state confiscation stands an economic desperation that demands explanation. When Vladimir Putin moved to seize $55 billion in assets from Russia's most powerful oligarchs, it was more than just a political maneuver. It was an act of economic shock therapy, a desperate grasp for control in a collapsing financial order. The move sent tremors through Moscow's elite circles, where once loyal billionaires now find themselves stripped of influence, wealth, and safety. For decades, these oligarchs were the economic pillars of Putin's Russia, funding everything from infrastructure to media and serving as the face of Russian capitalism abroad. Now, they are the sacrificial pawns in a high-stakes game of survival. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must recognize what $55 billion represents, not just numbers on a ledger, but a signal that Russia's economy has entered an emergency phase. The Kremlin facing dwindling reserves, an overstretched war budget, and unprecedented Western sanctions has turned inward. It's clawing back the fortunes it once helped create. Putin's message is as chilling as it is clear. No one's wealth is untouchable when the state itself is at risk. In a country where power and money have long been intertwined, this act shatters the unspoken pact that has defined post-Soviet Russia, the deal that allowed oligarchs to thrive in exchange for loyalty. Observers around the world are asking why now. The answer lies in the slow but steady unraveling of the Russian economic system. The war in Ukraine has drained the treasury, cut Russia off from Western capital markets, and forced the Kremlin to rely on internal wealth extraction. With oil revenues falling and foreign investors fleeing, the government's capacity to sustain its military and social spending has hit a breaking point. Putin's regime, rather than risk open financial collapse, has chosen to liquidate its own oligarch class. It's a move rooted in necessity, not ideology, a last resort for a leader trying to keep the machinery of the state running. Yet beneath this economic urgency lies a deeper political calculation. By seizing oligarch assets, Putin reinforces his image as the ultimate arbiter of wealth and power. He transforms what could be seen as economic weakness into a performance of strength. A declaration that the Kremlin, and not the marketplace, decides who wins and who loses. It's a tactic straight from the authoritarian playbook. When the walls close in, turn crisis into spectacle. The Russian public, wary of inflation and shortages, may even see this as justice, a populist cleansing of the corrupt elite. But beneath the surface, it's a redistribution of wealth from private hands to state coffers, not to the people. The oligarchs themselves are trapped in a paradox. Many of them built empires through state connections, enriched by privatization deals in the 1990s and sustained by Putin's patronage. Their fortunes were never truly private. They were always contingent on political favor. Now, that dependency has become their downfall. Those who once dined and in the Kremlin's gilded halls are watching as the same system they fed now devours them. Some will flee. Others will submit, hoping to salvage a fraction of their influence. But none can escape the underlying message in Putin's Russia. Loyalty buys time, not safety. Internationally, the seizures have reignited debates about the nature of Russia's capitalism. Was it ever truly capitalism or merely a farce aid masking state control? The $55 billion confiscation blurs the line completely. It reveals a system that, under pressure, abandons free market pretense and reverts to authoritarian command. For global investors and governments, it's a chilling warning about the fragility of property rights in autocratic regimes. And yet, it also exposes a broader truth about the world's economic order, that when crises erupt, even capitalist systems can turn inward, reclaiming wealth to preserve power. Putin's asset seizure is not just an episode in Russian politics. It's a moment that captures the essence of a system eating itself alive. It shows how the elite, once untouchable, can become disposable when the survival of the state is at stake. It's a story of betrayal, desperation, and control, and a reminder that in the twilight of empire, money becomes the first casualty of power. Russia's economic collapse has become the silent engine driving Vladimir Putin's most drastic political maneuvers, and the recent $55 billion asset seizure from oligarchs is only the visible tip of a much deeper financial iceberg. Beneath the grand displays of state power lies a nation grappling with the consequences of isolation, war, and systemic decay. The image of Russia as a resilient, resource-rich superpower is quickly unraveling, replaced by a harsh reality of declining revenues, shrinking trade, and an increasingly desperate government trying to keep its economic machinery from seizing up entirely. The question that now echoes across global financial circles is simple yet haunting. Has Russia's economy already crossed the point of no return? For years, Russia relied heavily on oil, gas, and raw materials to sustain its economy and finance its ambitions. Those commodities funded state budgets, military expenditures, and a sprawling system of political loyalty. But after the invasion of Ukraine, Western sanctions struck at the heart of that model. Banks were cut off from international systems, major exports were restricted, and foreign investment dried up almost overnight. The Russian ruble, once propped up by energy revenues, began to lose its footing, and inflation crept into everyday life. What followed was an economic slow bleed. Not the dramatic collapse of a single day, but the gradual suffocation of a system built on dependency. In this environment, Putin's regime faces a grim arithmetic. War costs money, billions every month, and without steady inflows of Western capital or technology, the Kremlin must fund its ambitions domestically. But the Russian private sector is too weak, too fearful, and too dependent on state favor to generate real growth. Foreign reserves have been depleted, imports of critical goods, from semiconductors to aircraft parts, have been disrupted. Factories are producing less, wages are stagnating, and living standards have fallen sharply. For a government that built its legitimacy on the promise of stability, this economic erosion is nothing short of existential. It is here that desperation becomes strategy. The state's response has been to tighten control over banks, over industries, and now over the fortunes of the oligarchs themselves. The seizure of $55 billion was not an act of economic planning, but an act of triage. The Kremlin is trying to plug holes in a sinking ship with whatever it can grab. This is not reform, it's survival. The optics, of course, are managed carefully. State media portrays the confiscations as patriotic, a move to reclaim national wealth and punish disloyalty. But beneath that narrative lies an unmistakable signal of weakness. A government that must consume its own elite to stay afloat is a government running out of options. The ripple effects are already visible across Russian society. Prices for basic goods have soared. Small and medium businesses, the backbone of any resilient economy, are suffocating under red tape, shortages, and uncertainty. Skilled professionals, from engineers to software developers, are leaving the country in record numbers. This brain drain has hollowed out the workforce that once gave Russian industry its edge. Meanwhile, The war economy consumes what remains, diverting resources away from public welfare toward defense production and military logistics. It is an unsustainable trade-off, one that accelerates decline rather than halting it. Internationally, Russia's economic predicament has transformed its global posture. Once a formidable player in energy markets, it now sells oil at steep discounts to China and India, effectively mortgaging its future for immediate liquidity. Its dependence on these few trading partners exposes the fragility of its position. What was once a global energy empire has become a desperate bargain. And the irony is hard to miss. A nation that once wielded energy as a geopolitical weapon now finds itself dependent on the goodwill of others just to stay solvent. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of this crisis is how invisible it remains to many inside Russia. The government has mastered the art of concealing collapse through controlled media, manipulated statistics, and nationalist rhetoric. Citizens are told that the hardships are temporary, that the West is suffering more, that Russia is strong and self-sufficient. But beneath the propaganda, ordinary people feel the truth in their wallets, in the cost of bread, in the empty shelves, in the fading promise of tomorrow. Economic collapse rarely announces itself with fireworks. It creeps in quietly until one day, the illusion of normalcy disappears altogether. The deeper tragedy is that this economic downfall is not the result of natural disaster or bad luck. It is the consequence of choices. Choices to prioritize war over welfare, control over competition, loyalty over innovation. As Russia's economy buckles under its own contradictions, Putin's government scrambles to project power even as it loses the means to sustain it. The seizure of wealth, the crackdown on dissent, the tightening grip, all of it points to a regime consumed by its own creation. What we are witnessing is not just the bankruptcy of an economy, but the bankruptcy of a system built on exploitation, fear, and illusion. The collapse of the long-standing alliance between Vladimir Putin and Russia's oligarchs marks one of the most profound political and economic ruptures of the modern era. For decades, these powerful magnates stood as both the architects and beneficiaries of Russia's capitalist experiment, a class born from the ashes of the Soviet Union's collapse. They built sprawling empires in energy, metals, banking, and media, and in return, they funded political stability through loyalty to the Kremlin. Yet today, that bond has fractured. The same oligarchs who once sat at Putin's side are watching their fortunes dismantled and their influence erased. What was once a partnership of power has now turned into a campaign of punishment, and the spectacle is as political as it is economic. The unraveling of the oligarch order did not happen overnight. For years, Putin's rule depended on a delicate balance. He allowed the wealthy elite to prosper, so long as they remained politically obedient. They were the financial lifeline of the regime, channeling capital into key industries and state projects while avoiding any challenge to Putin's authority. But as Russia's war in Ukraine dragged the nation into global isolation, that unspoken contract began to crumble. The Kremlin no longer needed loyalty, it needed liquidity. The oligarch's wealth, once tolerated as a symbol of Russia's capitalist strength, became a resource to be harvested in a time of national emergency. The government's recent move to seize $55 billion from the oligarch class represents more than just economic desperation. It is a calculated act of political reassertion. By targeting some of Russia's richest individuals, Putin is sending a message to the rest: their status, their empires, their privileges exist only at the mercy of the state. This spectacle of power serves a dual purpose. It replenishes the government's depleted coffers while simultaneously reinforcing Putin's image as a leader above corruption. A man willing to confront the very billionaires he once empowered. It's a masterclass in optics, the autocrat as reformer, the punisher of excess, the defender of national unity in the face of crisis. But beneath that veneer lies a far more cynical truth. Many of these oligarchs are not merely losing their wealth. They are being politically neutralized. Those who once financed political parties, owned media outlets, or maintained connections abroad are being systematically stripped of influence. Their businesses are absorbed into state-controlled entities, their assets frozen, their families pressured into silence. This is not just economic confiscation, it's the dismantling of an entire parallel power structure. The Kremlin has learned that when an economy falters, even loyalty cannot be trusted. Wealth, after all, has a way of wandering. Across borders, into offshore accounts, into the hands of rivals. By tightening control over Russia's richest citizens, Putin is not only plugging financial holes, but also eliminating potential sources of dissent. The irony is bitter. These same oligarchs were once the embodiment of Putin's promise, the idea that Russia could thrive under a hybrid system of authoritarian capitalism. They were his proof to the world that one could build prosperity without democracy, that order could coexist with wealth. But as the economy falters and the war's costs mount, that illusion has collapsed. The oligarchs are discovering that, in Russia's hierarchy, political loyalty has an expiration date, and economic privilege can vanish with a single decree. For a generation of men who built their power through proximity to the Kremlin, the message could not be clear. They were never partners, only instruments of convenience. Beyond Russia's borders, this purge of the elite has rattled international markets and deepened fears about doing business in the country. Western companies, already wary after sanctions and nationalizations, now see in Putin's actions a confirmation that private enterprise in Russia is hostage to political will. Investors who once tolerated risk in exchange for high returns now recognize that even billionaires are not safe. The line between private property and state power has been erased. What remains is a system where the Kremlin decides not just who gets rich, but who gets to stay rich. Inside Russia, the fallout has created an atmosphere of quiet panic among the remaining business elite. Many are moving assets abroad, seeking citizenship in friendlier nations, or retreating from public life altogether. The few who dare to speak out face swift retribution. A tax investigation here, a frozen bank account there, or worse, a public humiliation designed to set an example. In this climate of fear, entrepreneurship suffocates, innovation disappears, and the economy becomes a captive of political paranoia. What began as a campaign against a few wealthy figures has turned into a systemic shift. The end of the oligarch era and the birth of a new kind of economic authoritarianism. The spectacle of oligarchs losing everything they once owned is more than a Russian drama. It's a lesson in how absolute power consumes even its closest allies. For years, these billionaires believed they were untouchable, shielded by money and status. But in Putin's Russia, where loyalty is transactional and power is centralized, even the richest men are expendable. The fall of the oligarchs is not just a consequence of economic crisis. It's the ultimate expression of it, a reminder that in times of collapse, the state will always reclaim what it believes is its own. When Vladimir Putin ordered the seizure of $55 billion from Russia's oligarchs, it wasn't merely a demonstration of authority. It was a survival instinct disguised as strategy. The Kremlin's move reveals a critical truth about modern authoritarian capitalism. When the market fails, the state doesn't rescue it. It consumes it. Behind the facade of patriotism and economic reform lies a government scrambling to preserve itself amid bankruptcy. Sanctions and war induced chaos. This isn't the story of a state correcting inequality. It's the story of a regime tightening its grip, choosing control over freedom, centralization over competition, and survival over principle. For years, Russia's post-Soviet transformation was defined by its uneasy balance between political autocracy and economic liberalism. Oligarchs were allowed to accumulate enormous fortunes so long as they served the system. The state, in turn, tolerated private capital as long as it could extract its share. But now that the machinery of capitalism has broken down under the pressure of war and sanctions, that fragile balance has collapsed. The government, faced with vanishing reserves and international isolation, has chosen to reassert itself as the ultimate economic power. Putin's recent confiscations make one thing unmistakably clear: the era of shared prosperity between the state and the elite is over. What replaces it is a form of economic nationalism designed not to create growth, but to maintain authority. The rhetoric accompanying these seizures is deliberately crafted. State media frames the confiscations as a patriotic act, a necessary measure to protect Russia from corruption and disloyalty. It's an old tactic, but an effective one. By portraying the oligarchs as greedy traders who abandoned the motherland for Western luxuries, the Kremlin turns public anger away from the government's economic failures and toward the ultra-rich. It's a political sleight of hand, the creation of an internal enemy to mask systemic decay. And for a population battered by inflation, shortages, and declining living standards, that narrative resonates. People want to believe that their suffering is the price of purification, that the state is finally standing up to the exploiters. What they don't see is that the confiscated wealth is not being used to rebuild the nation, but to fund its continued militarization and sustain the bureaucracy that governs them. This dynamic illustrates how the Russian state's relationship with capitalism has fundamentally changed. When times were good, the oligarchs were the engine of profit. Now, as the system contracts, they've become the fuel for its preservation. The logic is simple. When a regime loses access to global capital, it turns inward, monetizing loyalty, coercion, and fear. Putin's government is no longer interested in fostering competition or innovation. It is interested in obedience and control. The free market, to whatever degree it existed in Russia, has been replaced by a command economy with capitalist trappings, where the appearance of wealth remains, but its ownership belongs to the state. Internationally, this shift has not gone unnoticed. Economists and political analysts alike describe the Kremlin's approach as a kind of reverse privatization, a mass nationalization of wealth designed to consolidate the ruling elite's power. Western sanctions have only accelerated this trend, pushing Russia to become more self-contained and inward-looking. By seizing oligarchic assets, the state both punishes those seen as weak links and sends a warning to others in this new order. Loyalty is measured not by wealth, but by submission. The oligarchs who once symbolized Russia's integration into the global economy are now symbols of its retreat from it. Yet beneath the spectacle of state power lies the unmistakable scent of desperation. Every seizure, every new regulation, every patriotic decree is a reaction to the crumbling financial foundations beneath the Kremlin's feet. Oil and gas revenues, once the lifeblood of the economy, can no longer sustain the costs of war and sanctions. The ruble's volatility has eroded consumer confidence, and foreign reserves are shrinking fast. The government's solution, to cannibalize the assets of its own elite, is less a display of strength than an admission of weakness. When a state begins to devour its wealthy to feed its coffers, it's not asserting dominance, it's delaying collapse. Inside Russia, the effect is chilling. Business leaders are paralyzed by fear, unsure where the line between safety and treason lies. Entrepreneurs who once dreamed of building independent enterprises now see that autonomy as a liability. Even mid-level bureaucrats understand that the new system rewards compliance, not competence. Innovation is dying, replaced by bureaucracy and propaganda. The once vibrant, if imperfect, world of Russian commerce has become a shadow of itself, existing only to serve the state's immediate needs. What makes Putin's consolidation of wealth so compelling and so dangerous is its duality. To his supporters, it appears as a moment of strength, a decisive move against greed and corruption. But to those who look deeper, it's the final act of a system devouring its own foundations. When the market fails, authoritarian regimes don't liberalize. They tighten their grip, converting economic collapse into political opportunity. The Kremlin strategy may keep Putin in power for now, but it does so by sacrificing the very forces that once made Russia competitive. In this struggle between market freedom and state survival, the latter is winning, but at a price that may prove fatal. While the Kremlin focuses on seizing on $55 billion from Russia's oligarchs and projecting an image of strength, the reality on the ground for ordinary Russians is increasingly grim. For the vast majority of citizens, life has grown harder, not easier. As inflation surges, wages stagnate, and basic necessities become scarce. The human cost of this economic reordering is profound, yet it is often overshadowed by headlines that focus on billionaires and geopolitical maneuvers. Behind the pomp of state confiscation lies a society grappling with the consequences of a government prioritizing survival over welfare, control over prosperity, and power over people. The economic pressure on ordinary Russians has been building for years but has intensified in recent months. The war in Ukraine has drained state resources, disrupted trade, and limited imports of essential goods. Prices for food, medicine, and fuel have risen sharply, outpacing wage growth and eroding household purchasing power. Families who once managed to make ends meet now face daily calculations of survival, cutting corners, and sacrificing needs to cover essentials. The narrative of patriotic sacrifice, repeatedly invoked by state media, does little to conceal the growing hardships experienced by millions. For many, the seizure of oligarch wealth seems distant, almost symbolic, because it does not translate into tangible relief. The stark contrast between elite and ordinary experiences fuels a sense of injustice that cannot be ignored. While billionaires see their assets confiscated in high-profile, often televised events, ordinary citizens struggle with empty shelves and rising rent. The redistribution of wealth in Russia is not aimed at social welfare, but at maintaining the machinery of the state. Military expenditures, bureaucratic salaries, and political projects absorb the funds reclaimed from the oligarchs, leaving minimal benefit for the broader population. In this context, patriotism is commodified and public suffering becomes a tool for legitimizing extraordinary measures, even as it deepens inequality. Employment and small business sectors also feel the brunt of economic instability. Sanctions, coupled with internal restrictions and state intervention, have slowed production, reduced demand, and created uncertainty that discourages entrepreneurship. Small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of a resilient economy, face collapsing revenues and unpredictable regulatory environments. Skilled professionals, disillusioned by stagnant opportunities and low trust in economic institutions, are increasingly leaving the country, creating a talent vacuum that threatens long-term recovery. The average worker, therefore, is doubly burdened, first by the cost of living crisis, and second by the depletion of opportunities that could offer stability or advancement. The social consequences extend beyond economics. Public frustration, while muted by censorship and fear, simmers beneath the surface. Citizens see the immense wealth concentrated in the hands of a few only to be seized and funneled into the state apparatus, and they understand instinctively that their hardship continues unabated. This creates a tension between the narrative promoted by the government, that wealth confiscation is an act of justice, and the lived reality, where ordinary people see no improvement in their daily lives. It is a tension that shapes public perception, eroding confidence in institutions while reinforcing the perception of state control over every facet of life. Even in terms of health care, education, and public services, the pressures of a collapsing economy manifest visibly. Hospitals face shortages of medicine and equipment. Schools struggle with underfunding, and infrastructure projects stall. While the oligarchs' wealth is redirected to reinforce state power and military campaigns, citizens' access to basic services declines, highlighting the disparity between symbolic redistribution and meaningful support for the populace. In practical terms, the state is prioritizing power consolidation over public welfare, a choice that has far-reaching social and political implications. International observers note that Russia's internal economic policy increasingly prioritizes stability over growth, coercion over opportunity, and control over innovation. Ordinary citizens, therefore, are left to navigate a system designed to extract compliance rather than foster prosperity. As the government seizes wealth and reinforces its authority, the population experiences rising living costs, dwindling opportunities, and a sense of precarity that touches every aspect of life. The human consequences are immediate, tangible, and widespread, creating a landscape where survival becomes the daily focus, and the promises of past prosperity feel increasingly out of reach. This disparity between state action and public experience is stark. While headlines celebrate the dramatic confiscation of oligarch fortunes, the ordinary Russian experiences a very different reality, one defined by scarcity, uncertainty, and diminishing prospects. In this environment, the human toll of economic policy becomes impossible to ignore. The more the state focuses on consolidating wealth and power, the more ordinary citizens bear the hidden costs of that consolidation, living in a world where billions move behind closed doors while daily life grows ever more precarious. Vladimir Putin's decision to seize $55 billion from Russia's oligarchs has ramifications that extend far beyond Moscow, reverberating across global financial markets and reshaping perceptions of state power in times of economic crisis. This is not simply a domestic issue, it is a warning to the world that when economies falter, governments may prioritize consolidation of control over adherence to market principles or property rights. The international community watches closely as Russia demonstrates a stark reality in moments of desperation. Even the most entrenched capitalist structures can be subordinated to political survival. The implications are profound, touching investors, policymakers, and nations that rely on stable, predictable economic systems. The global shockwaves of Russia's asset seizure are immediate and measurable. Financial analysts have re-evaluated the risk of doing business with Russian companies. Foreign banks are tightening exposure, and multinational corporations are reconsidering investments in politically volatile environments. The message is unmistakable. Wealth and property, even at the highest levels, are vulnerable when the state perceives its own survival to be at stake. For countries with large private sectors, the lesson is chilling. No market is immune to the whims of political power when systemic pressures mount. Investors who once viewed Russian oligarchs as partners now see them as instruments, and potentially expendable instruments, of an unstable regime. Russia's approach also